By the end of this video, you'll understand how a single factory accident in wartime Detroit quietly exposed a belief that thousands of industrial workers had been encouraged to trust during World War II. At the time, American factories were operating at unprecedented speed. Workers were told that safety had not been sacrificed, that production could increase without putting lives at greater risk. But one incident revealed that this assurance did not match reality. And once the facts were examined closely, the belief could no longer explain what had happened. This is the story of how a routine workplace accident revealed that wartime safety was not what it appeared to be. To understand why this moment mattered, it's important to understand what factory workers believed and why that belief felt reasonable. During World War II, Detroit became one of the most important industrial centers in the United States. Factories that once produced consumer goods were rapidly converted to support the war effort. Output increased, schedules tightened, production lines ran longer and faster. Despite these changes, workers were repeatedly assured that safety remained a priority. Management emphasized that procedures were in place, equipment was reliable, and risks were being carefully managed. The message was clear. Factories could move faster without becoming more dangerous. This belief was not controversial. It was reinforced daily through signage, briefings, and official communication. Safety was presented not as something fragile, but as something already under control. The belief endured because it aligned with necessity. Workers depended on steady wages. Factories depended on uninterrupted output. The war depended on both. In this environment, trust in official assurances reduced uncertainty and allowed people to focus on their tasks. Many workers had already accepted industrial risk as part of factory life. Minor injuries were familiar. Noise, heat, and fatigue were routine. The idea that these conditions could exist without escalating danger felt plausible. More importantly, questioning safety carried emotional weight. Raising concerns could be interpreted as slowing production or undermining the broader effort. Trusting the system felt not only practical but responsible. What made the belief particularly resilient was how it was framed. Safety was treated as a promise rather than a condition to be continually tested. As long as production continued and major incidents remained rare, the assumption held. Workers were not asked to evaluate safety themselves. They were asked to trust that it had already been accounted for. And for a time, that trust appeared justified. Accidents happened, but they were seen as isolated. Procedures were adjusted quietly. The belief that the system itself was safe remained intact. Nothing in daily factory life immediately contradicted the belief. Machines operated as expected. Shifts ended. Output targets were met. The pace felt intense, but manageable. The system functioned. As long as results appeared stable, there was no reason to revisit the assumption that safety had been preserved. The belief persisted, not because it was proven repeatedly, but because nothing yet had forced it to be tested. That test would come not through debate or warning, but through a single incident that made the gap between promise and reality impossible to ignore. By the early 1940s, Detroit's factories were operating under conditions they had never experienced before. Production schedules were accelerated, shifts were extended, output targets increased dramatically. The priority was speed, not experimentation. Delays were seen as threats, not just to profits, but to the war effort itself. In this environment, risk became normalized. What would have raised concern in peacetime was reframed as necessary strain. Faster machines, longer hours, and reduced downtime were treated as signs of efficiency rather than warning signals. The belief that safety had been preserved allowed this pace to continue without resistance. Another reason the belief held was the consistency of official reassurance. Factory management, government agencies, and wartime production boards emphasized control and competence. Communications focused on preparedness, oversight, and modern industrial capability. Safety messaging did not disappear. It was carefully managed. Workers were told that procedures had been reviewed, equipment was reliable, and safeguards were in place. These assurances were delivered calmly and repeatedly, reinforcing the idea that risk had already been accounted for. The absence of visible crisis became proof. As long as factories kept running and catastrophic failures remained rare, reassurance felt justified. For many workers, questioning safety carried personal consequences. Factory jobs offered stability during uncertain times. Wages supported families. Interruptions threatened income. In a wartime economy, alternatives were limited. Raising concerns about safety could mean being labeled difficult, replaceable, or uncooperative. Even when risks were noticed, the incentive to speak up was weak. Silence became a form of self-preservation. Trusting official assurances allowed workers to continue without confronting the possibility that the system itself might be unsafe. When accidents did occur, they were rarely interpreted as systemic failures. Instead, they were explained as mistakes, errors in judgment, lapses in attention, or unavoidable consequences of factory work. This framing protected the belief by isolating incidents from the system that produced them. If an accident could be attributed to a single worker, the larger structure remained intact. This interpretation reduced the need to question pace, equipment, or procedures. Responsibility was localized, and the belief survived. Perhaps most importantly, doubt never accumulated in one place. Concerns were individual, scattered, and fleeting. One worker noticed fatigue. Another noticed a shortcut. Another experienced a near miss. But these observations were not connected. Without shared discussion or visible acknowledgement, each concern remained isolated. And isolated doubt rarely challenges an established belief. As long as production continued and assurances remained consistent, the belief that factories were operating safely under wartime conditions held firm. Not because it was deeply examined, but because it was never forced into question. As production intensified, small warning signs began to appear, but they rarely stood out. Machines overheated more often. Maintenance windows shortened. Temporary fixes became permanent solutions. None of these changes were dramatic on their own. They were absorbed into daily operations as part of the new normal. What once would have prompted review was now interpreted as the cost of urgency. Because output targets were still being met, these signs were treated as manageable rather than concerning. Alongside minor injuries, near misses increased. Equipment failures were narrowly avoided. Workers adjusted instinctively, compensating for malfunctions or delays without formally reporting them. These moments passed without documentation, discussion, or follow-up. Near misses are easy to dismiss because nothing happens. The absence of injury reinforced the belief that safeguards were sufficient, even when those safeguards depended on constant vigilance rather than design. To maintain pace, procedures were quietly adjusted. Steps were skipped, safety checks were abbreviated, guards were removed temporarily and never replaced. These changes were framed as efficiency improvements, not risk increases. Once a shortcut worked once, it became repeatable. Once repeatable, it became acceptable. Over time, deviation from original procedures no longer felt like deviation at all. The key reason these details failed to provoke concern was familiarity. When risk accumulates gradually, it rarely feels urgent. Each small change is compared not to the original standard, but to the last adjustment. This slow drift made danger harder to recognize. By the time conditions were measurably different, they no longer felt unusual. Despite these developments, no comprehensive review followed. Reports focused on output. Inspections prioritized production continuity. Safety metrics were measured by the absence of major incidents rather than the presence of growing risk. As long as serious accidents remained infrequent, the system appeared stable. The ignored details were not hidden. They were simply not connected. By the early 1940s, Detroit's factories were operating under visible strain. Fatigue increased. Equipment aged faster. Margins for error narrowed. Yet none of these pressures were framed as threats to safety. They were framed as evidence of effort. The belief remained intact, not because warning signs were absent, but because they were reinterpreted as proof that the system was holding. Until it didn't. The moment that forced the belief into question did not arrive as a dramatic crisis. It arrived as an accident that did not fit the explanations workers and managers had relied on. During a routine shift, a machine malfunctioned in a way that existing procedures were supposed to prevent. The sequence of events was ordinary enough at first. Equipment in use, workers performing familiar tasks, production moving at pace. Then something failed. What followed was not immediately recognized as exceptional. Accidents were expected. But as details emerged, it became clear that this incident could not be attributed to a single mistake or lapse in attention. The safeguards that were meant to contain risk had not worked. As the incident was reviewed, a pattern became visible. The malfunction was not the result of one broken component. Multiple safeguards had been bypassed or rendered ineffective. Temporary adjustments, made earlier to maintain speed, had interacted in unexpected ways. What failed was not a person. What failed was a system that had been stretched beyond what its safety assumptions could support. This distinction mattered. If the accident had been isolated, the belief could have survived. But the conditions that produced it were widespread and familiar. The accident exposed a gap that could no longer be ignored. Official assurances had emphasized that increased output had not increased danger. But the facts told a different story. Safety had not disappeared, it had thinned. Margins had narrowed, redundancies had been removed. Protection depended increasingly on workers compensating for risk in real time. The belief that the system itself was safe no longer matched observable reality. And once that mismatch became visible, reassurance lost its power. Attempts to explain the accident followed familiar patterns. Individual error was suggested. Mechanical failure was cited. Unusual circumstances were emphasized. But none of these explanations accounted for how many conditions had aligned to make the accident possible. The belief could not absorb this contradiction. It had relied on the assumption that safeguards were independent and reliable. The accident revealed that they were interconnected and fragile. This was not a deviation from safety. It was a demonstration of its limits. The belief did not collapse publicly. There was no statement declaring that wartime safety assurances had been false. No announcement acknowledged systemic failure. Production did not stop, but recognition occurred quietly. Workers understood that the system could no longer be trusted in the way it had been. Managers understood that existing explanations were insufficient. The belief lost its usefulness, even if it was never formally rejected. The accident did not argue against the belief. It made it irrelevant. After this point, safety was no longer assumed. It became conditional, dependent on vigilance, caution, and adjustment rather than reassurance. The system had revealed that it could function smoothly until it couldn't. The belief that factories could operate at wartime speed without increased risk had reached its limit. The accident did not shatter the system, but it exposed the truth beneath it. After the accident, there was no public admission that the belief about wartime safety had failed. Production schedules were not halted. Official statements remained measured. The language used to describe the incident avoided broader conclusions, emphasizing continuity rather than disruption. From the outside, little appeared to change, but within the factory, the meaning of safety had shifted. Behind the scenes, reviews took place. Procedures were examined. Equipment settings were reconsidered. Some of the temporary adjustments that had been made to maintain speed were quietly reversed. Others were modified. These changes were practical, not symbolic. They were introduced without framing the accident as proof of systemic failure. Instead, they were treated as refinements, necessary responses to an unusual event. The belief was not confronted directly. It was worked around. Among workers, the impact was immediate. The accident had demonstrated that safeguards could fail together. Trust and reassurance gave way to caution. Tasks that had once felt routine were approached more deliberately. Workers compensated where they could, slowing movements, double-checking steps, watching equipment more closely. These adjustments were informal and uneven, shaped by experience rather than instruction. Safety became something managed personally rather than assumed collectively. Despite these changes, the pressure to produce did not ease. Output targets remained. Deadlines continued. The broader demands of wartime industry did not allow for prolonged disruption. This tension shaped the response. Factories balanced acknowledgement of risk with the necessity of continuity. Safety improvements were constrained by the same urgency that had contributed to the accident in the first place. The system adapted, but only within limits. The belief that wartime production could remain safe under accelerated conditions was never formally withdrawn. Admitting otherwise would have required acknowledging that risk had been underestimated and that assurance had outpaced reality. In the context of war, such admissions carried consequences beyond a single factory. Instead, the belief faded quietly. As adjustments accumulated, the original assurance lost relevance. It was no longer relied upon, even if it was never openly challenged. The most significant consequence was not procedural. It was perceptual. Safety was no longer taken for granted. It was treated as something fragile, dependent on conditions rather than promises. This shift did not come with closure or clarity. It came with adaptation. Workers and managers moved forward without resolving the contradiction between what had been said and what had been revealed. The belief had not been disproven publicly. It had been set aside. The collapse of the wartime safety belief revealed how it had been constructed in the first place. The assurance that factories could increase speed without increasing danger was not built on constant testing. It was built on confidence. As long as production continued and major incidents were rare, safety was treated as a settled condition rather than a variable. This framing mattered. Safety was presented as an inherent feature of the system, something already accounted for, rather than something that required continual verification. Once framed this way, questioning it felt unnecessary. The belief survived not because it was repeatedly proven, but because it simplified a complex reality. Another revelation lay in how efficiency came to stand in for protection. Output, speed, and continuity became the visible measures of success. When those measures were met, the system appeared to be functioning properly. Risk, by contrast, was invisible until it manifested. As long as machines ran and quotas were achieved, safety felt implied. The accident revealed that efficiency and safety were not the same thing. A system could appear stable while quietly accumulating risk. The story also revealed why warning signs were so easy to overlook. Minor injuries, near misses, and procedural shortcuts did not interrupt production. They were absorbed into routine. Each incident, taken alone, seemed manageable. The system evaluated itself by outcomes rather than conditions. As long as failure was infrequent, the belief held. The accident exposed the flaw in this logic. Risk can accumulate silently, and stability can be misleading. The collapse demonstrated the limits of reassurance as a safety mechanism. Official messaging had emphasized preparedness and control, but reassurance could not compensate for thinning safeguards. Once the accident made this visible, reassurance lost credibility. No new statement could restore confidence. The belief failed because it relied on trust where observation was required. The accident clarified a distinction that had been blurred. Safety was not a static condition. It was a balance, one that shifted as speed increased, margins narrowed, and procedures changed. Treating safety as fixed allowed risk to grow unchecked. The belief collapsed when this imbalance became undeniable. Finally, the story revealed a broader pattern. Beliefs tied to urgency persist because they reduce friction. They allow systems to move faster by minimizing doubt, but they also delay correction until evidence becomes unavoidable. The accident did not expose dishonesty alone. It exposed a system that had confused reassurance with protection. After the factory accident exposed the limits of wartime safety assurances, life inside Detroit's factories did not pause to reflect on the moment. Production continued. Shifts resumed. Machines were repaired or replaced. The urgency of war did not allow for extended reckoning. From the outside, the system appeared unchanged. But beneath that continuity, something essential had shifted. There was no formal admission that the belief had failed. No announcement corrected earlier assurances. No statement acknowledged that speed had quietly overtaken protection. The belief was not officially withdrawn, because doing so would have required confronting how deeply risk had been underestimated. Instead, silence filled the gap. The absence of acknowledgement allowed the system to move forward without revisiting its own assumptions. As adjustments accumulated, the belief stopped being relied upon. Workers no longer assumed safety simply because it had been promised. Managers no longer treated reassurance as sufficient. Safety became something negotiated day by day rather than assumed as a fixed condition. The belief did not collapse dramatically. It became irrelevant. Over time, the accident itself faded from collective memory. What remained were altered habits, greater caution, informal safeguards, and an awareness that systems under pressure behaved differently than promised. The lesson survived not as a story that was told, but as a practice that endured. This story matters not because it revealed a single failure, but because it shows how beliefs persist under urgency. The safety lie endured because it simplified reality and reduced friction. It collapsed only when reality forced attention to what reassurance had concealed. No argument ended it. No authority reversed it. It ended when experience made it impossible to ignore. The factory accident did not stop the war effort. It did not halt production or rewrite policy overnight. What it did was quieter. It exposed the distance between what systems promise and what they can sustain. And it showed that belief, once separated from observation, can endure long after it stops protecting the people who rely on it. The belief did not fall loudly. It quietly stopped explaining the world.